Now, the situation at the moment is here in New York, hospitals are absolutely overwhelmed. Keep in mind how many hospitals there are in New York. The mayor told us, I think it's something like 150 or 60 hospitals. The hospital situation is being stabilized now. Obviously, in the early going, they had to triage out, triage meaning, you know, make decisions on who gets immediate treatment and who does not. The situation in the hospitals is, what last report was beginning to stabilize some because there is so much hospital help available in New York and in the surrounding areas. Some of the casualties were taken to hospitals outside New York into the suburban areas. Some elements of the National Guard have been called into service in New York to back up New York's outstanding police and fire departments. The police and fire departments here, of course, in this large city being very large, some 40,000 plus police when you count the transit police available here, very large fire department, but no city anywhere in the world could count only on its own resources when attacked in this way. Now, police say no one is going to the World Trade Center until the fire is out, and the fire is definitely not out. There are people believed trapped inside the debris of the now totally collapsed World Trade Centers. Both of the World Trade Centers have collapsed. Mayor Rudolph Giuliani told us in our CBS News interview that some of the people bound to have been trapped. Others leaped from the building in terror, in effect forced out by the fire and explosions. And one pauses almost every time you see these scenes, because if you didn't know that this was real and this videotape was taken as it happened, and you see some debris and in some cases people coming down the side of the building, you would say it must be from a horror movie. It is horrible. It is not a movie. John Serra, forgive me, is on the telephone. He was on the 47th floor of one of the World Trade Center buildings when the plane hit. Mr. Serra, thank you for being with us. What was it like?
It was very scary. We thought it was a bomb at first. The whole building shook. I was in number 1 World Trade Center, 47th floor, and I work in securities area. And first we thought it was a bomb, then we all ran towards the main door away from the windows, and we saw debris flying outside and everything. And then out in the hallways there was a lot of smoke. So we stayed in the office. We didn't go out into the hallway. We tried to get in touch with people to find out what was going on. Someone's relative called and said that it was on CNN that a plane had crashed into the building. And another person I work with called and spoke to a friend she knew down in security, and he confirmed that, and they told us to stay put, not to leave yet. A few minutes later, we were told it was okay to start going down the stairs, and it was about 45 of us. We waited till everybody got out, and then we started down the stairs, and there was not that much smoke in the stairways, and we all had wet rags and kept it in front of our face. And when we got out into the stairs, people were coming down from the 70th and 80th floors, and later on we saw some injured people. People would yell down, "Stay to your right," and people that had burns and some were cut up or whatever. We went down first, and also some pregnant women shut down. Everybody was very helpful and orderly in the stairs, and then we started seeing firemen after we got down to the, I think, third. Firemen were coming up, walking up, carrying equipment, and at one floor, people were passing out bottles of water from a water machine so we could, pour the water on our heads and keep the rags wet. And the smoke was not that bad, We were able to get down slowly, and I think it was 10 o'clock when I got out of the building, and that's when some debris fell down, and I was across the street, and we ran down into like a subway entrance. At that point, I became covered with the soot and the ash and everything. And then I just walked up north as far as I could, up Broadway. My sister works at Spring Street in the Village, and I went to her office. She wasn't at work, but the people in the office helped me clean up, and And then I walked across the Williamsburg Bridge and came to my sister's house in Greenpoint. And I was able to contact my wife and children, let them know I was okay, and friends. It was horrible. It was unbelievable. I cannot fathom that the buildings collapsed. I can't.
John Serra,
Yes.
eyewitness who was on the 47th floor of one of the World Trade Center buildings. Thank you.
Thank you.
For your moving eyewitness account.
Thank
We go to Los Angeles. Brian Jenkins with the Rand Corporation, one of the world's ranking experts on terrorism. Mr. Jenkins, thank you for being with us. This is unprecedented today. Give us some context for it.
It is unprecedented in terms of the enormity of scale of this attack. It has long been feared by those who analyze terrorism, who look at these things, that we could see a major attack on U.S. soil. And certainly there have been many scenarios that have been tested in the various exercises that have been conducted in cities across the United States. But there is nothing in the exercises that prepares you for the stunning images that we have seen today that will take us years to digest.
Mr. Jenkins, there's never been a similar occasion, but on other occasions there's been a lot of conclusion jumping, and a lot of the conclusion jumping has been wrong. Now, there is a sort of center of gravity building around the belief that this is the work somehow, some way, of Osama bin Laden and his organization. Give us some perspective on that.
Certainly, the Osama bin Laden organization would have to be included in any short list of suspects, but it is really too early to jump to any conclusions. Keep in mind that it has been less than 6 hours since the first attack. Now, clearly, in terms of the enormity of the attack, the kind of an organization that would be required, the resources that would be required to carry this out, the style of the attack, that is consistent with some of the modus operandi that we've seen come out of the Middle East in the past. But let's wait for the evidence to take us to the conclusion as to who is responsible. Right now we know what has happened. It will take some hours, some days, potentially even some weeks to figure out who did it and exactly why they did it, if they needed a why.
Brian Jenkins in Los Angeles from the Rand Corporation. Scott Pelley is in Lower Manhattan. Scott?
Dan, thank you, Officer. Dan, I've made it down nearly to the base of the World Trade Center. I can see the building here. It is... Dan, it's very difficult to describe. What I see left of one of the World Trade Center towers looks to be about 10 or 15 stories tall. There is black smoke rising over the hulk, the sun behind it. Police officers are moving. The smoke is coming out. There's a building there are two buildings next to the World Trade Center. Both of them are involved in fire. There's fire shooting out of the windows of those two buildings. Large pieces of glass and pieces of these buildings to the street. Dan, the scene here on West Broadway is astonishing. New York City traffic was stopped and incinerated right here in the street. I see a number of New York City police cars that were obviously the first responders to the catastrophe that have been blasted to pieces, thrown over on their sides, and burned. There are a number of U.S. postal vehicles in the street that have literally, Dan, just melted. U.S. postal trucks that have melted in the street. There is a large bus, could be a city bus, might be a kind of a Greyhound bus. Impossible to tell because it has been completely burned away, and is sitting just in the middle of West Broadway. As I reported to you earlier, the street is thick with several inches of muck that is made of...
Good afternoon and welcome back to continuing coverage of the tragedy, the terrorist attacks here in America. We do have some local stories to pass along to you throughout the afternoon here on News 6 as we are getting information in here to us.
Richmond now playing a role in helping survivors of this one. 20 people that were in the Pentagon explosion today are being transported from the D.C. area to Richmond to go to MCV for treatment.
And a lot of people are calling here asking how they can help through giving blood. We are trying to get that information and we'll pass that along to you about any blood drives, any longer hours for the facilities, and we will try to get that for you as well. The city pretty much has shut down. We do have some federal offices here. The post office is not operating today. That is a federal office. And the governor has spoken today here in town, and the city manager has spoken about an emergency plan. They've limited access to City Hall. They've heightened police visibility in and around the downtown area as well to, at the very least, make people feel more safe.
Let's find out more now about the local effects at the federal buildings. Here's our colleague Giuliani.
Well, Ray and Cheryl, some of the buildings were closed, some were open, but employees said just a general feeling of disbelief. First off, the Federal Reserve Building allowed non-essential staff to leave earlier today. Now everything is operating as scheduled, but the flag is at half-mast outside the Federal Building where the office closed at 11 o'clock this morning. Employees were asked to leave after a meeting by staff there. As you know, security had been beefed up at all the federal buildings here in Richmond after the Oklahoma City bombing. Now some Richmonders were trying to get through to loved ones in New York. Others, like Daniel Young of Lynchburg, were in the federal building today trying to enlist in the Army when all of this happened.
I was right in the middle of doing my physical and come to the front desk and come to find out closing the building down because the World Trade Center and the Pentagon have been attacked. And you know, it was a shock to all of us in there. A lot of the personnel started running around, you know, getting antsy, you know, that was wrong. We need to find out what happened and who did it. And we need to take care of the situation as fast as possible.
My brother got through to my cousin this morning. He lives in Manhattan. Actually, he was asleep because he worked late last night, didn't realize that anything was happening. Look out his window, and the Trade Center is on fire, and crumbling no less. So it was quite a shock to all of us.
Now, as you know, that person got through. I have family in New York. I've been trying all morning. I haven't been able to get through. Both my parents are working in Manhattan, so I'm just waiting patiently like a lot of others.
Hopefully you'll get good news soon. What has been the mood of the people that you were talking to?
Quite upset, thinking, oh no, not again after the Oklahoma City bombing. Something like this could actually happen again, and maybe possibly even in Richmond. They were very nervous, so they were glad to be evacuated.
All right, thank you, Jean.
4 state workers were to meet this morning in the World Trade Center complex. Fortunately, they were not in the building yet when the planes first hit at 8:45 this morning.
And a statement was released from Governor Jim Gilmore. He actually spoke to the Commonwealth this morning. He says he's putting the Virginia National Guard on alert. One of our co-workers here has actually gone on alert as of today, a person who works in our graphic arts department. The governor also mobilized 300 members of the Virginia Air National Guard, but said he didn't want to release any more details about that. The governor said he has not gotten any word about any Virginians who may have been directly involved yet in the attacks, either in at the Pentagon or in New York City.
Number of closings, cancellations today. More on that situation locally from our colleague Stephanie Rochon.
We want to just mention to parents that a lot of the after-school programs have been canceled. A number of school districts canceling those today, so you may want to call your school to find out the status of your child. Also, as Cheryl mentioned, the post office is not accepting any mail this afternoon, a federal building, so those are going to be closed throughout the area. A number of religious leaders understand that people want to be together at a time like this and pray, so we have a number of vigils and prayer services to pass on to you. First Unitarian Church on Blanton Avenue will have a service tonight at 7 o'clock. The Cathedral will have a service at 7:30. Slash Christian Church in Hanover will have a service tonight at 7 o'clock. We'll pass on more of those as they come into us. And also, as Cheryl mentioned, we have a number of people who would like to donate blood to the injured that are in New York. And also in Washington, D.C., we're making some calls on that, and we'll try to pass that on to you when we have our next cut-in.
Thank you, Stephanie. Again, 20 people from the Pentagon involved in this morning's explosion are being brought to Richmond for treatment at MCV.
As you can imagine, probably a shortage of blood here and definitely a shortage in Washington and New York City. A lot of people are calling. They want to do something. They feel very helpless in this situation, as I think we all do at this point. The shock still is settling in.
There's a lot we know, but there's more we don't know yet. One number we just heard, and I'll brace you for this, the number we heard so far, the death count, 10,000. That's the initial estimate. Of course, that is going to change by the hour. I got an email from a viewer, Cheryl, who asked me to ask you folks to fly your flags today in support of our great country.
That would be a great tribute, absolutely. We are going to continue following our local coverage throughout the afternoon. We are going to rejoin CBS right now for national coverage.
The most capable of rising to meet the challenges of this type of attack. And right now we want New Yorkers to remain calm, to go about their business, to appreciate the fact that everything to provide for their safety is being done. to appreciate that everything that can be done to provide for the health and the needs of the people who are still at risk is being done, and that we will continue to work to make sure that we get through this as strongly and quickly as possible. I want to thank the federal administration. Secretary Thompson has been on the phone with me a number of times, as well as the President, for what they are offering and prepared to do. And we're just confident that, while this is a horrible attack, and one that is despicable and really unthinkable in its magnitude, we will get through this, and we will continue to have a great and free country.
Governor Pataki of New York, standing at the side of New York City Mayor Giuliani. On the phone with us, Senator John McCain. Senator, you're speaking to us from where?
I'm on Capitol Hill, Dan.
Senator, this is a time for assessing what has happened to us today, as well as extending what we can in the way of help and our prayers to the families of those who've been most directly affected. But the question hangs out there that we pride ourselves on the defense of the United States of America, and we spend hundreds of billions of dollars preparing for, the eventuality of war. But how much thinking has gone into the new kind of war? This is something we haven't faced before.
Well, something that you and I have discussed in the past. We went from a very dangerous world to, during the Cold War, where we faced the threat of nuclear incineration, to a very dangerous world where we face these kinds of terrorist threats, including proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. And I think the reality is that we'll have to assess our intelligence capabilities. I don't think there's any doubt that we have superb technical intelligence capability. We abandoned to a large degree the human intelligence capabilities back in the late 1970s, and we may have to. I've always said that we needed to do more in that direction. I think that it is remarkable, some of the things already that we know, including the fact that these hijackers must have known how to fly an airplane. That's a pretty. Your average terrorist doesn't have that capability. The sophistication of this operation is mind-boggling, and obviously we're going to want to know why our intelligence capabilities were not what we wanted them to be.
Senator, true or untrue that there have been occasions over the last, let us say, decade, when the evidence pointed clearly to some sort of state-sponsored terrorism. I'm not suggesting that this was state-sponsored terrorism. I'm saying clearly we don't know what this is.
Yep.
But is it true or untrue that in the past, over the last decade, there have been those occasions when the evidence pointed to certain states, and that for one reason or another, neither the executive nor legislative branch of our U.S. government wanted to attend to that, the decision was made to look the other way?
I don't know if the intention, if the action was to just look the other way, but I think there were indications. Whether there was conclusive proof or not was a judgment that was made by our leaders, both in the executive and legislative branch. I have felt that there's been involvement, but I'll be honest with you, Dan, I never thought that an operation of this sophistication and size would take place. I just never did. But I don't think there's any doubt that there are countries, Iraq, Iran, Libya, North Korea, and others, who we know engage in proliferation of capabilities and have from time to time involved themselves in state-sponsored terrorism. But never did we imagine on a scale such as this.
Senator John McCain, thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
The earliest the FAA says it would consider lifting ground stoppages, this has to do with air traffic in this country, will be 12 noon tomorrow. Again, as we have so often, we need to pause and absorb that. This has never happened in the history of the country. The FAA early in the day said it wanted all flights in the country stopped, just shut it down, given the situation. Now the FAA says that it will consider lifting the ground stoppages at or about 12 noon tomorrow. Obviously, that could be subject to change, but that's what the FAA says at the moment. Sandra Hughes, CBS News correspondent, is at LAX, the Los Angeles International Airport, where some of the flights involved in the hijacked suicide missions, as it turned out today, were headed. Sandra?
The last few hours inside, excuse me, I'm just going to have to take this out of my ear because I can hear myself and it's very distracting. I've just spent the last few hours inside the LA International Airport. It has now been evacuated and closed down. I spent most of my time at the American terminal, and we saw some family members, what appeared to be very grieving family members arriving. They were surrounded by police and whisked up the stairs to a private room. We're assuming that those were family members of some of the folks who were on those 2 American flights that crashed. But most of what we saw was chaos, confusion with the passengers there, people trying to book flights, most people just being told, go home, call us later. We then walked down to the United Terminal, a much different scene down there, Dan. It was a heightened state of security. Police tape was all around the terminal. It was completely closed down. We saw the Los Angeles Police Department bomb squad suiting up and going inside the United Terminal. We tried to get a little bit closer and we were pushed back. Just as we've been standing here a little bit away from the airport, we have seen many police cars with their lights and sirens on, many emergency vehicles rushing in that direction. So what appears to be a heightened state of alert. Right now they are just continuing to evacuate everyone from the Los Angeles airport who is an essential personnel. Also, just around California, Disneyland, the major attractions, they've all been closed down. The Bay Bridge up in San Francisco, any major bridge like that in the state of California, a heightened state of alert. Many state buildings have been closed down and evacuated. That's what's going on here in California, Dan.
Sandra Hughes at Los Angeles International Airport. We go to Mika Brzezinski, who is live now in Lower Manhattan. Mika?
Yeah, Dan, I've just moved up from PS 89, which is 3 blocks from the scene, Dan, because what they've told me is that we had to get out. They were going to try and get rid of what's left of Tower 1, and I was in the line of fire, so I ran 10 blocks up to our SAT truck here on Canal and West, and I've had a first chance to take a look at what is behind me, and I can't believe it. This is Midtown Manhattan. This is New York, and the heart of it is a scene of terror and hate. I've also caught up with some families here. Dan, I don't know if you remember, I was speaking earlier at the school with a frantic father who was trying to find his son who went to PS 99. Those children were evacuated to nearby schools. He couldn't find his son. He also couldn't find his wife, who was in Gateway Plaza, the apartments right across from the World Financial Center when all this happened. His wife and his 3-year-old child were in there. He could only get close enough to see that the windows were blown out. And now I have with me Michael Gashler and Julie Brown and their 2.5-year-old son. I take it you live there as well. What can you tell me about the scene from what you know?
Well, it's Gateway Plaza right now is evacuated, basically. And what's happening is that there's another building that's about to come down. They called it Building 80. But what I understand for that father, that the kids in school are safe. As we walked up...
The kids in all of the local schools, Stuyvesant High School, PS 89, which is right at the scene of the disaster, they have been transferred to nearby schools. PS 3 is one of them. They are all okay, but a lot of parents like you trying to find their families. And Gateway Plaza, it appears the apartments were not unscathed in this.
No, especially the ones facing the World Trade Center. They were blasted out, and we were lucky being in the apartment and not evacuating like they asked us to, because we were safe inside. We were able to close the windows, and we didn't then suffocate when the debris came down, when the buildings collapsed.
I take it as this happened, you were actually about to bring your son to a daycare center inside the World Trade Center?
Five World Trade Center, yeah. On the plaza level. That's where we have it at the Children's Discovery Center. We don't know whatever happened to that, but I got to believe it's buried by now with the debris. But we normally would be there at 8:30, and we just got up late, so we got lucky.
What is your reaction, Julie, to what you're hearing so far about this being an act of terror and seeing this literally at your home?
Well, having been down here when the bomb went off back in the early 90s, it's... I don't know what to say about that. I'm still in shock over it all happening, and that time I was lucky enough not even to be at home. I was in Midtown, and this time being at home, I have to say that my first concern really was to get my son out of there.
Like many families who are right now struggling to be reunited, some of them will be lucky enough to have that happen. I also have with me Michael Ingbar, who was sleeping with earplugs on when the plane began to fly toward, one of the planes began to fly toward the World Trade Center. Tell me what happened after that.
I was just on my roof. I had my binoculars and I'm looking at it, and I thought it was a Superman movie or something, or a science fiction movie. And then I saw a huge explosion. I saw people falling out of windows, and I couldn't tell whether they were jumping or they were just falling. It looked like were pieces of metal. And then I put my binoculars on, and I saw it was actual people just jumping out of the buildings or falling out of the buildings. And just a big explosion, like it was explosion with fire. It was like a movie set. It didn't look real. I still believe I'm in a dream or something, or a nightmare.
I think a lot of us do. A lot of us even covering the story. I was frantically at one point trying to get in touch with my husband, who's also a reporter. Everybody in some way, shape, or form is connected to this in some way, with so many people working inside the World Trade Towers, 50,000 people at height level, Dan. It is going to be an act of terror with reverberations across the country. And of course, this morning we are still picking up the pieces and trying to figure out exactly what happened, and there are people trying to figure out where to go. They're literally walking up the West Side Highway, which is usually crowded with cars trying to get in the middle of the morning, and right now it is literally a walking path. The only thing you see coming through here right now are literally hundreds of fire trucks and EMS crews. When I was down there, I was close to the scene, at the scene, literally, when the towers came down. Byron Pitts and I were actually standing at the corner of Murray and West, where you heard Scott Pelley reporting from, and we were there when the towers went down. We literally ran from the roll of thick debris and smoke to the point when we ran into PS 89 to get as far quickly escape from this sort of toxic cloud. Literally, when we got inside the school went black. It was like night, because when the cloud came over us and the debris started to hit, when you literally went back outside again, where we were standing was only crushed cars, debris, and cement. Dan.
Mika Brzezinski, live reporting from Lower Manhattan, although the picture you're seeing at this particular moment is videotape of the collapse of the World Trade Centers. Yes, both of the 110 stories World Trade Centers have collapsed. All U.S. security markets have closed. A conference call is scheduled tonight to decide whether to reopen tomorrow. Bellevue Hospital medical director, quote, "This is a catastrophe of unparalleled proportions," unquote. And the reason it is a result of what you're seeing on videotape. First one of the World Trade Center towers collapsed. Yes, collapsed. It looks like one of those scenes of an old building being, purposely dynamited and blown up. In this case, hijacked airliners, two, both of them American Airlines planes apparently, were crashed, first one, then another, into the World Trade Center. And then first one tower and then the other collapsed, completely collapsed, and buildings around them collapsed. People were seen jumping, being forced out of the building on high floors. People on the street gasped as each person was seen coming out of a window. Abraham Lincoln, 1864. "Let not him who is houseless pull down the house of another, but let him work diligently and build one for himself, thus by his example, assuring that his own shall be safe from violence when built." Yes, it's a long quote, but something to ponder on this day, when America has much to ponder, including the fact, and it is the fact, that we've been taught since we were school children that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. Clearly our vigilance has not been what it should have been in the days preceding this catastrophe today. And if you think the word catastrophe is an overstatement, then perhaps you want to rethink it. Because many, many people have died on this day. Some at the Pentagon, we hope a few, we don't know how many at the Pentagon when a plane crashed there. But the mayor of New York, police officials, everybody says when the death toll is finally counted from the total collapse of both of these towers of the World Trade Center, there will be a high loss of life. Some people are believed trapped in the remains as we speak, and operations are being mounted to try to get to them. You remember those scenes from Oklahoma City. Remember Oklahoma City, one federal building, terrible as it was, how long it took to get organized, to get those people who were trapped in the remains, as was the case in Oklahoma City. Many heroic deeds this day, most of those deeds we do not yet know, but police, firemen, ordinary citizens have performed their heroic deeds this day. And while many lives have been lost, many lives have been saved. And it's a day that will, as was the case with Pearl Harbor, live in infamy in American history. We go to John Roberts in Washington. John, perhaps bring people up to date on where the president is and where he isn't at this hour.
Well, Dan, as we try to grasp the enormity of this tragedy and as many times as you see the pictures, they still hit you afresh, an assault against all your senses. It's just impossible to understand the exact magnitude of all of this. The White House is trying to put the pieces back together here so that they can show that they are in control, to show America that they have a leader who is in command here and a person who is going to lead this country against the scourge of terrorism nationwide. Our what's called in-town travel pool was activated just a little while ago, been taken over to what we'll only describe as a government building in downtown Washington, D.C., for fear that people may be watching this broadcast in order to determine where the leaders of government are for a briefing about what the government does next. As best we can ascertain, Dan, the president most recently was at Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, where he made the address that you played the videotape of just a short while ago, and is now somewhere in transit over the United States, whereabouts and destination classified at this point. We understand that the vice president is still in Washington, D.C., though the congressional leadership has been ferried separately via separate helicopters to a location outside. But Dan, I think, and this has now been corroborated by two different sources now, there is a move by the White House to try to get the president back to the White House today. Dan, you mentioned a couple of hours ago now, at least, that the president want to get back to the White House today as a show of force against these terrorists. I believe that the administration is of the same mind, and they are in negotiations now with the Secret Service to make sure that they can adequately assure the safety of the president so they can get him back to the White House. Speaking against that, Dan, though, might be this idea that when the president on Air Force One left Barksdale Air Force Base, they trimmed down the number of media personnel, the White House press corps, who was following him from about 14 to 5, which may indicate that they were going to a smaller location, Dan. So still the information somewhat up in the air, all of this again classified because they do not want to reveal where the president or the vice president are at this point, but we should know more very soon. We'll get back to you on that.
Our White House correspondent John Robertson emphasizing that whenever the President of the United States travels, and he's on Air Force One, he has an incredibly sophisticated communication system aboard that aircraft. And while, as John Roberts mentioned, from all appearances and all reports, Vice President Dick Cheney, a very experienced elected and appointed official, is in charge at the White House itself in a secure position below ground in the White House, we believe. And Condoleezza Rice, head of the National Security Council, while on a minute-by-minute, hour-by-hour basis, at some point it appears that they were very much, at least in partial charge. Let no one, no matter how you feel politically, misunderstand. The President of the United States is in charge. He is the Commander-in-Chief. And whatever anybody thinks of him or doesn't think of him in the moment, he's the Commander-in-Chief. He's the leader of the nation. He is in Air Force One. He is in instantaneous communication when he wants to be any place in the world, and there should not be any misunderstanding about that. There'll be plenty of time later in the days and weeks to follow about whether he and his White House operation deported themselves as they could have and should have today. But as of this moment, no one should have any misunderstanding about the president being in charge. And with that in mind, we go to Bob Schieffer in Washington. Bob?
Well, Dan, very much in line with what John Roberts was saying about members of the White House staff wanting to get the president back to Washington because they believe that is the way to show the terrorists that they are not giving in. There is very much that same spirit up at the Capitol at this point. The Capitol Police Chief told us just a while ago that congressional leaders are going to make a decision later today about reopening the Capitol tomorrow, because they think that is the way to show that this government is still working. Joe Biden, who's the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, said earlier this afternoon, this Congress ought to be in session. When we're not in session, we're saying to the terrorists that they are winning at this point, and we don't want them to say that. So that is the mood. But of course, as John Roberts also pointed out, there are these tremendous security precautions and considerations that have to be taken at this point. So at this point, all we know is that the vice president, for example, is in a secure place. That is the only clue that members of his staff will give us as to where he is at this point. He's with his chief of staff, Louis Libby. His wife, Lynn Cheney, is also with him. But the White House staff tells us only the vice president is in a secure place. One other point, intelligence sources at this point have really not given members of Congress a great deal of information. Either they don't know or they're holding back on that. We are told that there will be substantive intelligence briefings for members of the intelligence committees later this afternoon, but at this point about all they know is that these were well-coordinated attacks, well-coordinated, well-planned out. At this point, it's our understanding that members of Congress have been given no information as to who specifically might be behind these attacks. We should also add, and these intelligence sources pointed out to us, that security forces, American forces around the world, have been on a considerably high state of alert in recent weeks, almost since the bombing of the USS Cole some months ago. Everybody has been expecting something. Nobody really expected anything of this gravity. Certainly nobody expected something as widespread as these attacks were. But that about brings it up to date as far as we can determine at this point, Dan.
Bob Schieffer live in Washington. This is CBS News continuing live coverage of the incredible acts of terrorism that were put forward.
And now some local coverage of the attack on America. Governor Gilmore has declared a state of emergency, which allows him to instantly mobilize military and police forces statewide across Virginia.
Of course, part of that reason is because one of these terrorist attacks today did occur in northern Virginia at Arlington at the Pentagon. We do have a crew that is very near Arlington right now. We're going to go live now by phone to Deborah Cox. Deborah?
Hi, is this Ray or Stephanie? I'm sorry, I'm having trouble hearing you on the cell phone. I think I might have a bad connection, but if you guys do have me live, I can tell you right now that we are currently about 2 miles outside of the Pentagon. We are obviously stuck in traffic. We pulled off into an area, into a shopping center right now. Traffic is backed up on Route 1 going both north and south. This is an alternate route going into Washington, D.C., which is parallel to 95. As you can imagine, 395, I'm sure viewers have heard, has been closed by authorities. The district is also shut down. No one can get into the district right now, which is one of the reasons why we are seeing so much traffic backed up on Route 1. We are in Alexandria, like I said, 2 miles outside of the Pentagon, and when we first pulled up, you could see a cloud of smoke coming from the area where this crash took place inside the Pentagon. Right now, the smoke has dissipated. We can hardly see it right now, which would indicate that I guess they are working on the fire that is currently inside the Pentagon. I spoke with a few people who work around this area, a couple of gentlemen that work at a Toyota dealership where we currently are parked along Route 1, and one of them told me it is a scary situation. They said that the Pentagon is one of the most sacred places that you would think would not be touched, and this is a reason to be alarmed, and he said that he would be ready to fight for this country. Again, we are currently on Route 1, the Jeff Davis Highway, just within 2 miles outside of the Pentagon. That's the latest right now from where we are. We're going to send it back to you, Ray and Stephanie.
Pentagon employees say the entire building shook after that hijacked plane struck the outer rim today. That was Deborah Cox for us live in northern Virginia.
Of course, the Pentagon being the third of the attacked areas this morning, and Governor Gilmore did make a statement this morning just around 11 o'clock or so, has now declared a state of emergency this afternoon. Let's listen to what the governor had to say earlier today.
Ladies and gentlemen, the first thing that I want to do this morning is to extend my sympathies to the families who have lost loved ones in these terrible tragedies. Of course, this business is still unfolding, both in New York and in Washington and other places as well. We don't yet have any type of any enumeration of how many victims there may be, but this is clearly a terrific tragedy. America will remember this day and the men and women who have perished in these callous and cowardly attacks. I want to reassure Virginians that I'm taking all steps to ensure their safety during this crisis. And I also want to mention something, and that is that we don't yet have any information that indicates any types of imminent attacks in the Commonwealth of Virginia. So the people of Virginia should remain calm and collected at this time. There's no reason at this time not to be. And that would be what I would ask Virginians to do, simply to remain calm and comfortable that there is no information at this point of attacks here in the Commonwealth of Virginia, outside, of course, of the Washington area and the Pentagon. I wish to advise the people of Virginia and all of you of the certain activities that I have taken today. Number one, I have activated the Emergency Operations Center at the Department of Emergency Management. I have just activated 300 members of the Virginia National Guard, including engineers, medical personnel, and military police individuals. I've also placed the entire Virginia National Guard on heightened alert status as of this time. We've established contact with the Federal Emergency Management Agency and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, that is FEMA and the FBI, which are the appropriate people for our emergency people to be in communication with at the time of a situation like this. I've directed all law enforcement personnel across the Commonwealth to report any unusual criminal activity that they might see in connection with any type of hostage type of issue or any type of use of firearms, any type of issues like that, to the Emergency Operations Center, so that we can have a first alert and be prepared in the event that there's any sort of connection. There has been no such report like that up to this time. We have directed the Secretary of Transportation to work with the Navy to heighten port security at the Port of Virginia. The Department of Transportation of the state of Virginia has already taken security actions at the Port of Virginia. I have also been in touch today with Admiral Hatter, the Chief of Naval Operations, Atlantic Operations, who has advised me of certain security actions he's taking at U.S. naval bases in the Norfolk and Hampton Roads area. He and I have agreed to be in close touch all through the day and have exchanged our appropriate methods of communication so that we can do that. We naturally have heightened security at major buildings, including especially, of course, this Capitol building and the Governor's Mansion. We have directed state police to immediately go to work to ensure the best traffic flow in Northern Virginia under these circumstances. We directed the state police to provide assistance to the local and federal authorities that are responding to the attack of the Pentagon. I am in constant communication.
That is Governor Gilmore speaking this morning. He has since this afternoon declared a state of emergency here in Virginia. A lot of people coming to the aid. We just got a release from the American Red Cross. Philip Morris has donated $45,000 to the Disaster Relief Fund, earmarked specifically to help in the relief efforts in response to the terrorist activities this morning. The Red Cross also indicates that they have 80,000 blood donations in their inventory ready to ship to the affected areas.
Number of closings and postponements across the area. More on that from Stephanie Rochon.
Well, Cheryl just mentioned the need for blood, and we want to pass on to you that Virginia Blood Services is going to extend its hours until 9 o'clock tonight for people who want to donate blood for the injured in New York and in D.C. There are two locations, one on Westwood Avenue and also in the Arboretum in South Richmond. So for all the people who've been wanting to donate blood, Virginia Blood Services will extend their hours until 9 o'clock tonight. And a number of churches will have prayer services. We want to pass two on to you right now. Second Presbyterian Church in downtown Richmond will have a prayer service at 7 o'clock tonight. Gethsemane Christian Fellowship Church on Rick Street will have a prayer service from 6:30 until 10 o'clock tonight. We'll continue to pass those on to you. And as you've been hearing throughout the day, flights all across the country are going to be canceled. We've learned those are going to be canceled through noon tomorrow. So a lot of people are stranded here in the city of Richmond, and they're trying to get rental cars to get out. We talked to one man earlier this afternoon who lives in Baltimore. He's trying to get home, and he has called numerous rental car companies this afternoon trying to get a car. He finally found one, and here's what he told us.
Oh, it was a number of places I called, but came here to Avis, and unfortunately God opened up an opportunity for me to be able to get a car so I can get back home. I mean, Baltimore is probably about 2.5 hour drive. I'm expecting at least a 6 to 8 hour drive at least, but I have to get home to my family.
We talked with another man whose flight to Dallas was canceled. Luckily, he still had his rental car, so he is using his rental car to drive from here all the way to Dallas. So a few lucky people will be able to get home. It's just going to be a long drive. Avis says they're running out of cars everywhere, and many rental car companies are in the same situation.
Thank you, Stephanie. A very important convoy also heading south right now from the Pentagon to Richmond. 20 people affected by this morning's fire at the Pentagon are being taken care of at MCV in downtown Richmond.
This attack this morning has had a ripple effect here in the Richmond area. The federal buildings are closed. Some of the high-rise buildings, such as the First Union building, are closed. The Coliseum and the Landmark Theater will be closed tonight. And as Stephanie mentioned, a lot of the travel through the area, the buses not running north, the Amtrak not running north, and the planes not flying until at least noon tomorrow. As far as schools are concerned, all the afternoon, after-school projects have been canceled for today, but for now, school in session unless they say the governor decides otherwise.
And we'll have continuing coverage, but now back to CBS.
Based on your experience with looking into these kinds of things, and you said you made a trip to Afghanistan trying to get the Taliban government to help with catching Osama bin Laden. After there were attacks on the U.S. embassies in Eastern Africa in 1998, President Clinton authorized 2 sets of missile attacks, cruise missile attacks, one against in Afghanistan, one in the Sudan, in retaliation for what he said were clear indications that Osama bin Laden, and pointed out bin Laden's connections to Sudan and Afghanistan. My point is that after those attacks, bin Laden became even bigger in the minds of those haters of America, particularly those who are of Muslim religion, than he was before. So what I'm grasping for here is some indication of what does a nation such as ours, what are the options for this or any other president when this kind of thing happens? The last time, I say, one of the last times we launched these missile attacks, and frankly, the evidence is that they didn't do much good.
Dan, I think the president has a limited option here, and the option is if we can find bin Laden, locate him, get good enough intelligence, a massive retaliation against him. I think that's called for very clearly if he is the perpetrator. The second thing, Dan, is we need to get the international community, our allies, our friends, developing countries, to recognize that terrorism is a worldwide threat, that this has happened to everybody, so we've got to get more international cooperation, NATO, Asian nations, African nations. And thirdly, there's got to be a response against the countries like Afghanistan that may harbor these terrorists, or certain countries in the Middle East, that if they don't turn them over, and they have them, they can't use legalisms, and that they would also be subject to a very tough response. I think, Dan, with terrorism, you deal with it, needless to say, we need a stronger intelligence capability. We need to be better prepared. But we also have to have an international effort. We can't do it alone. But I think the most important step here, Dan, is we got to rally around the president, rally around as a country. This is an unprecedented attack. We've been violated. But you've got to start planning for the next day to ensure that this never happens again.
Former Secretary of Energy, former Ambassador to the United Nations for the U.S., Richardson, we thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Thanks for being with us. We mentioned that the missile attacks, the twin missile attacks against Sudan and Afghanistan targets in the wake of the embassy bombings, U.S. embassy bombings in East Africa in 1998. I think it was said, probably said by me, that the indication is they didn't do a lot of good. Let me amplify on that to say that Sander Berger, who was head of the National Security Council at the time that decision was made, among many others, has said, look, just because we didn't get bin Laden, just because we didn't hit the targets in some cases maybe we thought we were hitting, one of the purposes at that time was to send a message that we have reach, that we can reach the terrorists wherever they are. So for fairness and for accuracy, one needs to tack that on to the statement that, well, the evidence is that those missile attacks may not have done much good. Fuad Ajami, our CBS News consultant, longtime expert on foreign affairs, not just in the Middle East, is with us here for context and perspective. Fuad Ajami of Johns Hopkins University, you've been listening and monitoring carefully to what the leaders of the Taliban have said today. Now, among other things, they've said that bin Laden is not connected to this.
Right. Well, this is the Taliban, so you have to take whatever they say with some skepticism. The Taliban would like to hunt with the hounds and run with the fox. They have given sanctuary to Osama bin Laden, but they now insist that Osama bin Laden has been domesticated, that he doesn't have the logistics, he doesn't have the base with which to do these kinds of operations. I think we have to treat this with caution, and I think you've been doing, you've been trying to give this story the context that it deserves, and to deal with the horror without really trying to name people and designate culprits, because we simply do not know. But we do know that Osama bin Laden has been active in this kind of industry of terror. He's a wholesaler of terror. And we do know that in the East Africa bombings in both Dar es Salaam and Nairobi, he was implicated. We suspect that he was implicated on the attack on the USS Cole, where two of his followers, we think, in effect, hit one of our destroyers. And so we have arrived at this point now. And of course, the Taliban will be very, very cautious this time around, because they suspect that this time the response will not be pinpricks, it would be a very serious response.
Fuad, you've been studying this kind of thing for so long. There's always talk when this kind of thing happens. Couldn't happen without some state being involved.
Right.
Iraq, Iran, Libya,
Right.
Syria, North Korea, run down a list.
Right.
Is that talk realistic?
Well, it really, honestly, we just have no idea. I mean, I think this is a very slippery, the whole realm of speculation this far. I mean, we do know that obviously these kinds of terrorist operations must have sanctuaries. You know, it's not just one or two people who could do it. And we do know that it's the fate of a liberal power like us, like this great superpower, to be envied, to be resented. And look at this attack. This attack targets the Pentagon and the World Trade Center. It targets the symbol of our military might and the symbol of our financial, economic might. So both New York and Washington are the main targets. And it is a message to a great power that even though our wingspan is broad, even though our economic resources are vast, even though our military infrastructure and our military might is vast, we are vulnerable to these kinds of operations. And we do know that there is a tremendous amount of anti-Americanism in large parts of the world. In large parts of the world, there's a tremendous amount of anti-Americanism. In the world of Islam in particular, we understand this. But there is this anti-Americanism, and people like bin Laden feed off it. And bin Laden, in many ways, he is this, you know, not only is he active in a place like Afghanistan where they give him sanctuary, but there's sympathy for him everywhere. Because bin Laden, if you will, he holds out the message that this great hegemon, this great superpower that straddles the world can still be hurt. And we are hurt by this. We have seen this.
Well, no doubt we're hurt. We have, well, we believe hundreds and possibly thousands of our fellow citizens dead. I want to hold to this point about certainly no one can speculate, and I've said repeatedly and want to say again, that early reports and speculation in these kind of situations, they are frequently wrong.
Sure.
Oklahoma City comes to mind. But right behind that, let me pause for a second and help our viewers and listeners. You've said, look, there is centered in the world of Islam, which is not monolithic any more than Christianity or Judaism or anything. There's centered, hate America elements. But I'm sensitive, I want to be sensitive to the fact that there are many loyal Americans, peaceful, law-abiding Americans who are Islamic heritage.
Of course.
And we need to pause, I think, for just a second, if I may say, and let's talk about that. What as a national attitude we should have toward our fellow Americans who are of Islamic religion.
Well, I think you've said it, Dan. I mean, you've even mentioned the Oklahoma City bombing as the cautionary tale. That as we jumped to look for Middle Eastern sources of that deed, it turned out to be just a clean-cut American kid who was responsible for it. So I think no one is really jumping to conclusions. But obviously, 4 planes that get hijacked. This isn't, basically your garden type, your garden variety episode. This is a very major episode. We've crossed the Rubicon in effect, that our sense of immunity to the currents of the world and to the passions and the furies of the world now lies behind us. I mean, we said this in a small way in 1993, the first time the World Trade Center was hit some 8 years ago. But this is a different order of magnitude altogether. And our sense of immunity to the passions that play on other societies, I think, is gone, and gone forever. I mean, we think that these things go on in Europe because Europe is close to the fire, and Europe is close to there's a world to its east which is problematic, and then there is a world to its south which is unstable. But we have entered this. And the experience of the Israelis is a great cautionary tale. Liberal societies are vulnerable to these kinds of attacks because there are all kinds of protections that individuals are accorded. And we accord them this because there's no other way. There's no other way of doing it. It's the price of being a liberal democratic society. It's the price we pay for power. Power begets nemesis in the world. So we sit astride the world, but in effect we pay the price of this ascendancy, the price of this kind of power. And we have this sense of innocence. We carry it with us. And we are innocent of these kinds of furies and these kinds of passions. But obviously, bin Laden doesn't think we're innocent. He thinks that we support the House of Saud, which he himself is a Saudi citizen and would like to overthrow the House of Saud.
In Saudi Arabia.
Exactly. And bin Laden thinks that we are implicated in what Israel is doing. And bin Laden thinks that we represent secularism when he would like to see a theocratic world in the Islamic world. And so the bin Ladens, their main threat in many ways is to the poor Islamic world that they have wrecked and ruined. And we are visited by these kinds of furies today.
Well, Fuad Ajami, as we look at these pictures, these horrifying pictures, some of them live, some of them on videotape today.
Yes.
And this picture, I mean, this is going to go down as one of the great photographs of all time, the plane actually coming into the World Trade Center. The 20th century was marked by wars characterized by clanking machinery and clashing ideologies. Is or is not what we're seeing today the face of 21st century war?
I think you're absolutely right. And this is the freelancer. This is the individual. Like it could only be, like here we sit, we are trying to understand the story. And fundamentally, in the end, it took 4 people, let's say, if it's really these 4 people who hijacked these planes, it will turn out to be, if the past is any guide and we ever get to the bottom of this story, it will turn out to be 4 young people in their 20s. They are available for these kinds of missions. They believe that this is the way to paradise or the way to redemption. And here we are talking about the whole idea of building, I mean, it's ironic and painful in retrospect. We're talking about the idea of building a missile shield for this country. Well, missile shield doesn't protect you against 4 kids who can get on 4 planes and take these planes and smash them into the World Trade Center and into the Pentagon. So it is the face of the 21st century, and it is the age of the freelancer. And we live with this. It's our fate, and it's the fate of power because of this connection between power and the nemesis that is always generated by power.
Well, as you point out, when a nation is what I call a combined superpower, and the world's only combined superpower, that is a military superpower and an economic superpower, you have many vulnerabilities. There is the vulnerability of missiles from rogue states, which the so-called missile shield is supposed to finish against. But then there are these other vulnerabilities, some of which have been exposed today. Fuad Ajami, thanks.
Thank you.
Hope to talk to you as we go along.
Thank you.
I want to straighten out one thing now that we have it straightened out. Here's what we know about the aircraft involved in this morning's events. American Airlines Flight 11, that's the one took off from Boston, headed for Los Angeles, was hijacked, a Boeing 767 with 81 passengers and 11 crew members. This was the first of the 2 planes that struck the World Trade Center, apparently the first. Then, American Flight 77, Dulles Airport near Washington to Los Angeles, a Boeing 757 with 58 passengers and 6 crew. This is the plane that apparently hit near the Pentagon. Now that's a change from what we believed was the case before. We thought that American Airlines had said both of its planes hit the World Trade Center, and about that we were apparently wrong, that the information we gave you was not correct. We now believe that American Flight 11 was the first to hit the World Trade Center. American Flight 77 coming out of Dulles hit the Pentagon. Then United Flight 175, Boston to Los Angeles, a Boeing 767 with 56 passengers and 9 crew. This apparently was the second plane to hit the World Trade Center. Now, with this new information, both of the aircraft that hit the World Trade Center originated in Boston, bound for Los Angeles. Both of them were Boston to LA flights. One an American Airlines flight, the other a United flight. And then United Flight 93, originating in Newark, New Jersey, headed to San Francisco with 38 passengers and 7 crew. This is the plane that apparently went down in Somerset County in western Pennsylvania, about 80 miles from Pittsburgh. Those are the 4 planes that we know of that were hijacked today. 3 of them plunged by suicide people who commanded the hijacking operation into targets, 2 at the World Trade Center, 1 at the Pentagon. We go to Mika Brzezinski in downtown New York. Mika.
Well, Dan, behind the fire trucks and the smoke and all the confusion that is now 10 blocks behind me, right down the West Side Highway here, is a horrendous and unimaginable mystery. Who made it out alive? The trade towers have vanished, and in their place, an ominous, slow-moving plume of smoke. Evacuations were so quick from the scene, from schools and buildings and apartments. There was no cell phone service at all, added to the confusion, and there's so little information coming about it out of the scene about the injured and the dead that people are literally lining up on the West Side Highway waiting and watching. That is all they can do. Now, we know of terrorist acts throughout your reporting in other parts of the country, but it's safe to say most people here can barely deal with what happened right here in New York City. I'm joined by 2 guys here, Michael and Christopher, and they actually saw much of this disaster unfold before their eyes. First of all, Christopher, where were you?
I was in a nearby office building, several blocks away, in a conference room on the northwest corner of the building. So we unfortunately had a very clear, unobstructed view of both towers. About 20 of us in the building or so, colleagues actually, gathered on one of the floors, one of the high floors.
So you heard the first hit?
Yeah.
You gathered and saw?
At least I didn't see the first hit. So we kind of gathered in this room, and we're just kind of discussing the events. And just within a matter of minutes, we noticed, again, what appeared to be, in such a short period of time, what appeared to be a large commercial plane at a low altitude, high speed, just, going right into the second tower. And it collided with the tower, the plane disintegrated, the building shattered, basically, and just a ball of fire.
In the room, the people around you, what? Was it silence?
It was, it's kind of hard. It's kind of really hard to, I believe so. Just complete and utter disbelief.
Christopher, tell us a little bit about the chaos and trying to literally get from where you were to where you are now. I understand you ran down 46 flights of stairs. Take it from there.
Yeah, I mean, as soon as we saw the second explosion, essentially, we just thought we're in, a 50, 60 floor building. We could be the next target. So we had no idea what was happening. You see 2 explosions like that, and everybody kind of just realized, wait, we're in danger too. And people just started, it wasn't chaos. It was just everybody was going as fast as they could down the stairs. And going down 46, 50 flights, it was pretty tough. We get outside, and then all of a sudden you see just this fireball coming out of the towers. And it was just a surreal experience.
Yeah, and bedlam. And the blasts, of course, Dan, as we know, there was 1, 2, and then 3 as the towers collapsed. And one security expert from inside the financial center said literally hundreds of people from beyond the police line were covered by the falling debris and the building itself. Dan.
Mika Brzezinski in downtown, lower Manhattan. President Bush, having started the day in Florida, made a short statement there, calling this an apparent terrorist attack. Then he flew to Air Base in Shreveport, Louisiana, made another videotape statement there, somewhat longer, in both statements assuring Americans that their government was continuing to function and that those responsible for this would be found and be held accountable, and asking for the prayers and thoughts of families most directly affected by today's tragedies. Then the president flew on to Nebraska, to Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, where he was last reported to be receiving, quote, a briefing on the situation. And at that particular Air Force base in Nebraska are the DEFCON planes, which are aircraft outfitted particularly to carry presidents aloft in catastrophic situations. Not to say that President Bush is going to go on a DEFCON plane. So far as we know, he plans to continue to fly on Air Force One. But where he will go, where he'll wind up, we do not know. He did not go back to Washington as he said he was going to do out of Florida. More about that as we go later on. Now we're approaching the half-hour mark. Every half hour, an hour, we try to recapitulate what we know, what we don't know, bring you up to date on the situation, and we do that in a very few moments. But let me point out a couple of things before doing that. First of all, New York hospitals continue to be absolutely inundated with the wounded from today's events in and around the World Trade Center. Some patients have been taken to outlying hospitals, suburban hospitals outside the city. There is a shortage of blood, as you would expect under these circumstances, and the American Red Cross is keeping open the facilities for blood donations in the city, in those areas of the city that are not affected by the explosions and fire and events in Lower Manhattan. So those blood donation centers are open. The FAA says that air traffic, which has been grounded in the country in an unprecedented act since early this morning, that tomorrow noon is the earliest the FAA intends to have air transport authorized again. Overseas flights headed for this country were ordered to either U-turn or to find landing places outside the United States. NATO was holding what was described as an emergency meeting, which was due to begin about a half hour.
Good afternoon and welcome back as we continue local coverage of the terrible tragedy, the terrorist attacks on America this afternoon. A lot of things, repercussions trickling down to our area as well. A lot of people here have family in that area. We have federal buildings here that have been closed down today. A lot of events have been canceled. A lot of businesses have shut down for the day as well.
Tracy Sears is downtown at the Capitol with more on Governor Gilmore's response to the day's tragedy. Tracy?
Well, Ray, it is a somber scene here, almost a stoic scene, as the rest of the nation, the governor is in shock, the governor's staff is in shock. This morning, the governor got word of the attacks when he woke up. He had been up most of the night. Apparently, his father was put in the hospital last night, so he spent most of the night up worrying about that situation. Of course, woke up to these attacks. Now, the governor is meeting behind closed doors in the Capitol building right now with members of his staff, trying to coordinate efforts with state agencies. Now let's take a look at some video that we caught earlier today. This was the scene at the Capitol building earlier this afternoon when word of the severity of this attack started to come in. The entire staff of the governor and Capitol employees were huddled around television sets trying to grasp what we were all seeing. Immediately after the Pentagon attack, state troopers shut down the Capitol building, brought out bomb-sniffing dogs, and began checking the credentials of everyone that was in the building. Now, the governor announced in a press conference earlier this morning that he's activated 300 members of the National Guard, including medical personnel, military police, and engineers. All military bases are also on a heightened sense of security, and all federal buildings in Richmond and across the Commonwealth have been closed down. Now, terribly ironic twist here. Governor Gilmore, over the last 2 years, has headed a national task force on terrorism. 2 years ago, he warned the president and Congress that America lacked a national strategy to countering terrorist attacks and needed to coordinate efforts.
At the second year of our study, we evaluated the entire situation that we saw with the local, state, and federals, and reached several conclusions, one of which that there was no national strategy to deal with such an attack and that one was necessary to be developed. We also concluded that there was an absence of coordination with local and state authorities, that the federal government's focus at that point had been entirely federal, and that there was a need to be coordinated with local responders because they will be the first on the scene.
Now, the governor said his first job is right now to reassure all the people of Virginia that the Commonwealth is not under immediate attack, that they are not at risk of anything, that they should be reassured that everything is taken care of. He has been in constant contact with the Admiral and the Navy in Norfolk, and that everything is secure. Ray?
Thank you, Tracy.
Tracy Sears live at the Capitol downtown.
And some extra tense moments earlier there today. 4 state workers, including the insurance commissioner, were at a meeting this morning at the World Trade Center. Luckily, they hadn't quite gotten inside the building yet. They arrived as a bedlam broke out. The insurance commissioner and 3 others are fine, but for a short time this morning, they were unsure. The folks here were unsure where that quartet was in New York.
And our governor actually was in Manhattan yesterday himself.
That's true.
And gotten back in time. Can't get very much anywhere today.
No.
Until at least noon tomorrow, all American Airlines airplanes are grounded because of this terrorist act. A lot of people are stranded in a lot of cities that they don't belong in today. Rental cars are not available in a lot of places now. Greyhound buses and Amtrak trains are not traveling north today.
This major disaster has caused a real ripple effect of logistical nightmares across the country. Richmond Airport, as is every other airport across the country, is closed. Our own colleague Greg McQuaid actually flew today from Boston to Richmond. He's fine for a short time, though. We hadn't talked to him, and we were a little concerned about Greg as well.
Right, there was some talk. One of the hijacked planes did come out of Boston's Logan Airport, which our Greg flew out of, and we're going to get some personal observations from him a little bit later on this afternoon.
Before we leave the airplane angle of the story, I did hear a number. 266 people were on those 4 hijacked planes that all crashed today. 266 will pale in comparison to the overall death toll, which we've heard so far will range at least 10,000 bodies.
This whole tragedy is hurting everybody, to the heart, and a lot of people are flocking to churches this afternoon. They want to be with people. They want to talk about this. Our Stephanie Rochon is standing by in the Breaking News Center with that angle of the story. Stephanie?
Cheryl, we went by the cathedral this afternoon because as religious leaders tell you, at a time like this, a lot of people will go to churches, go to their synagogues. They want to pray, find some strength. We went by the cathedral this afternoon. You can see pictures here. The priest mentioned that they had a larger number of people there for the noon mass than normal. As the service was over, as people were coming out, we had the chance to talk with a few of them about the attack today.
Fathom the enormity of the situation and just totally shocked that something like this could happen.
I was there a couple years ago, sitting on the 110th floor, having for a wedding with for my niece there, and so we're all touched by this. It could be any one of our families.
I mean, I don't understand. I feel very scared. I feel especially scared of what the United States may do.
And that's what we're all going to be waiting for next, is what is the U.S. response going to be to this? For people who could not attend noon services, a number of churches are going to be holding prayer services this evening. The cathedral has one at 7:30. First Commonwealth Church will have a special service tonight at 7 o'clock. It's on Buford Road. We also want to mention that Mary Washington College has canceled all its evening classes after 5 o'clock this afternoon. We've had a number of people wanting information on how they can donate blood to the injured in New York and Washington, D.C. Virginia Blood Services tells us that they are going to extend their hours at all their regular locations. They're going to be open until 9 o'clock tonight, so you can donate blood. We also want to mention that all the malls are going to be closed tonight, and we're told that Chesterfield Town Center will be closed as well tomorrow. Cheryl and Ray.
All right, thank you, Stephanie. A lot of repercussions. We do have an intern here at News 6 who is up on the campus of Mary Washington College and said that the students have basically just stopped and they're kneeling in prayer.
He's got some video to bring to us later in the day that we'll show to you tonight by 11 o'clock. Philip Morris, by the way, has given $45,000 to the American Red Cross to aid in the terrorist relief efforts. A real shortage right now of blood, and the American Red Cross was behind the 8 ball before today happened. Now they need our help.
And as Stephanie mentioned, the Blood Services, Virginia Blood Services, is having extended hours at all of its locations through 9 o'clock tonight, and they do have blood drives planned for the rest of the week as people do try to help, because we all need to come together in a situation like this.
It's an amazing day, one we'll never forget.
No, we won't.
And we'll have continuing coverage.
We will. Back to CBS national coverage now.
Osama bin Laden. But it's way too early to make any conclusions about that. It's just simply to note that speculation centers around Osama bin Laden, as it has in almost every other case of terrorism over the last 6 or 8 years. Although it's true that a lot of people in the United States never heard of Osama bin Laden before the explosions at the U.S. embassies in Eastern Africa in 1998 and the ensuing cruise missile attacks by the United States directed at targets in Sudan and Afghanistan. Before that, Osama bin Laden, he was known in intelligence circles and certainly known in the Middle East and around Afghanistan, but was not all that well known in the United States. A high-ranking federal law enforcement official has told our Washington Bureau that no one has been ruled out, but our initial feeling is that this is the work of bin Laden. That government official spoke only on the condition of anonymity. Chris Yates, a well-known aviation expert at Jane's in London, said, and I quote, "Only a small handful of terror groups could have pulled off this operation." And he says, and I quote him, "I would name at the top of the list Osama bin Laden." In Afghanistan, a spokesman for the Taliban rulers denied that bin Laden had any role. However, a London-based Arab newspaperman said that followers of bin Laden warned 3 weeks ago that they would carry out what he called, and I quote him, "a huge and unprecedented attack on U.S. interests." For whatever that may or may not be worth, President Bush ordered a full-scale investigation to what he called hunt down the folks who committed this act. That's a direct quote. Now, American Airlines initially said the Trade Center was hit by 2 of its planes, both hijacked, carrying a total of 156 people, but the airline later said that that was unconfirmed, and now we believe that one American Airlines plane hit one of the World Trade Centers, and then a United Airlines plane hit the other World Trade Center, is what the current belief is. Now, CBS News correspondent and 60 Minutes 2 correspondent Carol Marin is downtown and has a report. Karen? Carol?
As I'm making my way toward the Trade Center along the water line, thousands of people were walking towards me, streaming out, almost not talking, trying to get through on cell phones that didn't work. Some of them crying, all of them looking pretty agonized. All of a sudden I heard a roar and I saw one of the towers blow and then collapse and fill the horizon with smoke, and I yelled, "Oh my God." And I saw from street level, as though it had exploded up, a giant rolling ball of flame, and the firefighters screamed, "Run." And I turned to run, but I fell, and I felt someone scoop me up, tell me to throw my high heels off, and I was running in my stocking feet with him. And finally, as we ran and ran, he slammed me into a wall and covered my body with his. I could feel his heart beating against my backbone. And I think both of us were sure we were dead, because there was no way you could run fast enough and there was no way to avoid it. But somehow we escaped the flame, which was immediately followed by a storm of debris. We were breathing, it felt like giant particles of plaster, and there was smoke, so that if you tried to put your hand out in front of you, you couldn't really see it. It was the thickest, most intense particle and smoke I've ever been in. And somewhere along the line, the firefighter handed me off to a New York police officer. The thing that struck me, though, was that I didn't see many wounded people in the street, which led me to believe, at least where I was by the Trade Center, they had never even gotten out of the building. I thought I was going to die. It is as close as I've ever come as a reporter to thinking I was going to die.
Carol Marin, who was downtown early this morning when this catastrophe hit. I mistakenly said she was down now, which is what I thought, but this was a replay of a videotape interview we did with Carol Marin earlier in the day. You know, it's impossible not to compare this coordinated air attack, this undeclared act of war, with the attack on Pearl Harbor almost 60 years ago, the Japanese sneak attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. And it's just as clear as can be that December 7th, 1941 will be forever remembered as, in President Franklin Roosevelt's phrase, a day of infamy. But so too will now September 11th, 2001, go down in American history as a day of infamy. At this moment, you may want to recall that Pearl Harbor was a disaster that brought the United States of America together and propelled it to victory. A thought to ponder as we go through this afternoon. Now, around the world, there have been expressions of some expressions of solidarity with the United States. Tony Blair, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, made an eloquent short talk to that effect earlier in the day. Others among the United States allies in the world of freedom and democracy around the world have expressed similar sentiments. There have been some expressions of celebration. Palestinians on the West Bank some were said to shoot their weapons in the air today in what was said to be a celebration. Now, what we're waiting on right now is a briefing at the U.S. Defense Department. A Pentagon briefing is expected to brief shortly, and as mentioned earlier, a senior official of the FBI is also expected to brief very shortly. Admiral Craig Quigley will be briefing at the Pentagon. Now, if you're saying to yourself, well, where is President Bush? The answer is we don't absolutely know. He was last reported to be at the air base in Nebraska, getting a briefing. He had gone there from Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana outside Shreveport. He had gone there from being in Florida earlier in the morning. And as we await the beginning of one of these briefings, you're looking at scenes. This is a live picture in Manhattan. Perhaps, well, I think the world's best-known skyline with the Empire State Building off to the mid-left in your screen with that high, well, looks like a stick, little known, that was supposed to be a dirigible landing place high atop the Empire State Building. That's what it was designed to be, but no dirigible was ever able to get in there. And in that place, the Empire State Building, one of the landmarks of our country, recognizable all over the world. This is what the skyline, the New York skyline, looks like today. The World Trade Center's gone, both of them. Yes, devastatingly gone, right to the ground. Both of them crumbled, each after having been hit separately by hijacked American airliners. And we may be able to show you what the New York City skyline looked like before today. You can imagine, as you've seen the postcard pictures, if not all of your life, for a long, long time. But both the World Trade Center buildings, which had become, they really had replaced the Empire State Building as the principal landmark of New York City, both of them are gone. The former foreign minister of Israel, Shimon Peres, is in Jerusalem. Thank you for being with us, Mr. Minister. I appreciate very much you doing this. Do you think this terrorist attack on the United States is because of its close friendship with Israel?
An attack on the United States, attack, stop civilization and bring all of us back to the jungle. And I think we have to do whatever we can not to permit another war with terrible consequences to be spread over. May I say that each of us feel today like an American. Our heart is with the families, with the victims. It's full of pain. But we know the United States is a great and a strong country, and as we've won so many wars and suffered so many agonies, again, you and us and all of us will emerge stronger and more hopeful. I want to say that we have to draw consequences, all of us. We have had, or we are having armies against enemies that practically do not exist, but we have dangers without strategies and without armies. The most important consequence today is to develop a strategy against terror. It can happen every place, everywhere, and cause untold of damage and victims and blood and tears. And the time came for all of us to get ourselves organized. By the way, we send our own rescue team, which is already on the way to the United States. We shall do whatever we can to stand on the United States, which is leading the world, defending democracy, and enabling all of us to remain as a civilized community.
Shimon Peres, you know our country, my country, well. And you know that there are any number of people in the United States who believe these bombings today are a direct result of U.S. support for Israel over the years in the Middle East. To those people who say that, what say you?
Well, you know, there were other acts of terror that has nothing to do with Israel, including in the United States itself. Terror is a terrible way of destruction and killing. And you have all over the world acts of terrors that has nothing to do with Israel. Terror
Mr. Peres,
is a
if you'll
new
excuse me a
phenomenon.
moment, I know that you will understand this. I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but Karen Hughes, the principal assistant to President Bush, has begun to brief, and we'll pick her up in progress.
Evacuated for security reasons and to protect our workers. Your federal government continues to function effectively. We have a federal emergency response plan, and at President Bush's direction, we are implementing it. We began to implement it immediately after the first attack in New York this morning. We contacted American forces and embassies throughout the world and placed them on high alert. The United States Secret Service immediately secured the President, the Vice President, and the Speaker of the House, and they are all safe. They have also secured members of the National Security Team, the President's Cabinet, and senior staff. As you know, President Bush was in Sarasota, Florida when the first attack occurred this morning. Air Force One has now landed at Offutt Air Force Base in Omaha, Nebraska, and the President is in a secure location. He is in continuous communication with the Vice President and key members of his cabinet and national security team. Vice President Cheney and our National Security Advisor, Condoleezza Rice, are in a secure facility at the White House. I have just come from there. The Secretary of Transportation and other members of our White House senior staff are gathered at a command center there, and we are coordinating with other branches of our federal government. The Secretary of Defense remains at the Pentagon, and the Secretary of State is en route back to Washington from his trip to South America. President Bush is conducting a meeting of the National Security Council as we speak. They are meeting President Bush from his location and other members from different locations in Washington and other locations. As many of you have been reporting, the Federal Aviation Administration ordered all airports closed, and all planes which were in the air were directed to land at the nearest airport. International flights were diverted to alternate locations outside of the United States. Transportation Secretary Mineta has directed the Federal Aviation Administration to suspend operations until at least noon tomorrow. So no airline flights will operate until at least then, and until the FAA announces that operations will be resumed. Secretary Mineta has also issued orders controlling the movement of all vessels in United States navigable waters. The Federal Emergency Management Agency has activated 8 urban search and rescue task forces in New York, and 4 of these highly trained teams are at work here in Washington at the Pentagon. Every federal agency has implemented continuity of operations plans to make sure the government continues to function effectively. While the markets closed today because of the situation in Manhattan, the United States financial system has continued to operate. Banks have been open all day. The Federal Reserve has operated regularly and continuously. The Department of Health and Human Services has mobilized medical personnel and supplies to provide help to local authorities who are working so diligently to respond and try to help the victims of these terrible attacks. President Bush has committed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to identify and bring to swift justice those responsible for these despicable attacks. The Department of Justice is setting up a hotline for families who fear that their relatives may have been victims of one of these attacks, and we will be announcing that telephone number shortly. Our fellow citizens and our freedom came under attack today, and no one should doubt America's resolve. President Bush and all our country's leaders thank the many Americans who are helping with rescue and relief efforts. We ask our fellow Americans for your prayers for the victims, for their families, for the rescue workers, and for our country. Thank you all very much, and we will continue to update you as information is available and confirmed.
Karen Hughes, whom many people believe is one of the two most influential advisors around President Bush, briefing at FBI headquarters in Washington. Karl Rove, another Texan, transplanted Texan, but Texan being the other widely believed second most important person around President Bush. Karl Rove is believed to be with President Bush. The president was last reported at the Air Force Base in Nebraska, being debriefed there after going first to an Air Force base outside Shreveport, Louisiana, where he made a videotaped short talk to the nation. He'd gone there from Florida. When these events first began unfolding this morning, the president said in Florida he was going back to Washington. He did not do that. The official reason being that the Secret Service, among others, thought that they, under the circumstances, it would not be the most advisable thing for the president to go back to Washington. But what you see, if you look at the map, at least mentally, the president's gone from Florida to Shreveport, Louisiana, to the air base, Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska. Where he goes next is anybody's guess. But Karen Hughes just briefing at the FBI headquarters. Now, John Chester, a spokesman at the Pentagon, has a briefing underway there. Let's go to it live.
One thing I do, right, that the military, the service secretaries.
Well, we're obviously having some audio difficulties there at the Pentagon. We'll bring you up to date on what they said there. What we know about the Pentagon already is that an apparent hijacked aircraft, again a commercial airliner, was crashed into the Pentagon, and actually into, we're told, a helipad right next to the Pentagon. There was damage to the Pentagon itself. Flames and smoke consumed a portion of the Pentagon for a while. Mark well, since the Pentagon opened in 1943, this is the first time it's actually come under a direct attack. Nothing even approaching this had ever happened at the Pentagon before. After a somewhat long delay, the Defense Department confirmed that there had been fatalities. How many, we do not know, at the Pentagon, and we saw some of the injured being treated and then carried away earlier in the day. But we don't have a lot of information on what happened at the Pentagon just yet. Now, I'm told that we now have some audio from the briefing, so let's try again. Go to the Defense Department to pick up on the briefing. John Chester. Well, two strikes on that. We obviously don't have the audio of Mr. John Chester. Sorry, that mistake is mine, for which I apologize, but Mr. John Chester, we couldn't pick up the audio. This is one of those days when obviously we're doing the best we can to bring you as many live reports as we can. There's no way we can do it perfectly. Now, we had talked to Shimon Peres in Israel just as we were going, just before we went to Karen Hughes. And he was pointing out, this is a paraphrase of what he was saying, that yes, the United States has stood with Israel all of these years, but that under these circumstances, the Israelis certainly understood, perhaps better than some, the enormity of what was happening this day. And we do apologize for having to interrupt that interview in progress, but of course we did so to go to the Karen Hughes briefing. Now, we're coming up to nearly the hour mark, and as the hour mark passes, we'll bring you up to date on all of the facts and details as we have them. But in the meantime, let's go back to Washington and our chief Washington correspondent, Bob Schieffer. Bob?
Well, Dan, I am here with Senator Chuck Hagel, who's a member of the Foreign Relations Committee. He has been to a series of briefings. Let me ask you quickly, Senator, because we're pressed for time, we're going to come back. Is the talk now about reopening the Capitol tomorrow?
Yes.
And why would that be?
Well, the security, we believe, is clear, will be clear by tomorrow, and we don't want to shut down our government and our country. The terrorists win here. As long as we're securing our nation and our structure and our leadership, then I think we should move on, and we intend to do that tomorrow.
And Dan, Senator Hagel, of course, is the senator from Nebraska, Offutt Air Force Base, the former home of the Strategic Air Command, is where the president is. When we come back, we can talk to Senator Hagel about why the president went there. Dan.
Bob Schieffer in Washington. Bob, on the roof of a building in the far distance, you could still see some of the smoke from the Pentagon. The fire has subsided in the Pentagon, having been put out. The smoke may go on for a number of hours, perhaps even days, depending on how much damage. We don't really know how much damage there was done to the Pentagon. Understandably, the Pentagon is not giving out a lot of information about what the situation is there, it after all being the military heart of U.S. defenses. Now, here in New York, I want to show you what it looks like in Lower Manhattan at the moment. This is now, what, 7 hours after the first aircraft, hijacked commercial airliner, hit the first of the Twin Towers. Great smoke still billowing out. There has been smoke on the water and on the land for these 7 hours. And this smoke does not show any signs of going away anytime soon. Rescue crews on the ground, this shot taken from up high. Rescue crews on the ground frantically trying to do several things. One, attend to the wounded, some of whom are still on the scene, and two, put out the fires, and then try to search for people still believed to be alive in the rubble and ruin of the World Trade Center. They're organizing efforts to find those people. Some fire and police casualties have been reported. The full extent we do not know. There have been no fatalities reported among fire and police, but make no mistake, there have been at least some wounded among the fire and police help. You are watching continuing CBS News coverage of the attack on America. Dan Rather at CBS News World Headquarters in New York, where the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center have been hit each individually by a hijacked airliner, 4 hijacked commercial airliners that we know of today. This is an actual photograph of one of the planes flying to one of the towers earlier this morning. The plane goes deep into the tower. Flame spits out the opposite side. Followed.
It's an amazing video. Continuing coverage now of the local situation in Richmond and across Virginia. All federal offices and courts are closed in Virginia. State capitol also closed. Governor Gilmore has mobilized National Guard troops. We've got some video now of the scene at the airport where the Air National Guard has been mobilized. The governor's offered assistance to crews of the Pentagon as well. The FAA has grounded air flights all across the country, as well as Canada has also delayed flights there as well. We've learned in the past few minutes the FAA is going to continue to ground flights until at least noon tomorrow, causing a real traffic snafu across Richmond and across the country. Rental car agencies right now are being bombarded by requests for cars. I-95 north near D.C. right now very heavily congested. Many cars coming out of the D.C. area. And of course, Governor Gilmore has declared a state of emergency. After-school programs canceled all around the Richmond area. Virginia Blood Services right now in dire need of some support. If you can help out, they're going to stay open extra hours throughout the week. The locations include the Westwood location, the Innsbrook location, also Mechanicsville, Walmart, Chester Walmart, Virginia Center Commons, and Chesterfield Town Center, all places where you can donate blood. Dozens of candlelight vigils are being planned right now across the area, and right now we have crews around this area as well as around Northern Virginia. We'll have continuing coverage of the attack on America, a tragic day indeed. More coming up on the News 6 Network. Back to national coverage.
Journeyed into the downtown area very near the World Trade Center building itself. I was maybe 60 yards away, and we were able to see the World Trade Center building. What was left of it. I can only describe it to you, Dan, as about 15 stories tall with a broken top, completely shot through, a burning hulk. All around it in that neighborhood, the buildings were burning. The smoke that you see behind me is coming primarily from a 50 or 60 story tall building that was about half a block from the World Trade Center. That building is deeply involved in flame. There is flame shooting out of the windows. When we were below it just about 30 minutes ago, big panes of glass were popping out of the building and crashing below. Rescue workers really can't get into that area right now because it's much too dangerous. In the streets around the World Trade Center, Manhattan traffic stopped and was incinerated right where it stood. We saw a number of New York City police cars, obviously some of the first responders to the scene. The police cars were blown to pieces and completely burned. Some U.S. postal vehicles were actually melted onto the street just a few yards from the World Trade Center itself. I spoke to some firemen, Dan, from the Bronx, who were some of the first responders in, and they told us that after the first tower collapsed, they went in to try to save some people in the area around the second tower. And then the second tower began to come down. And these men looked over their shoulders and found an entrance to a subway and dived down the stairs into the subway as the World Trade Center tower came down around them. They told us that a police lieutenant was trying to warn them away at the time that the building was coming down. He had his arms high in the air, trying to get them to run, and they said that that lieutenant was hit by falling debris and, as best they could tell, was severely wounded. We've talked to a number of firefighters and paramedics who have been at the center of this hell and have come out covered in soot and dust and have told us amazing stories of heroism. One fireman told us that when the second tower came down, they were completely covered in black smoke and swirling dust, and the firefighters held each other's hands in kind of a human chain in order to get out of that area. Another firefighter, actually a retired firefighter who ran to the scene as soon as he knew what was happening, came out and told us that he didn't see any wounded people around the World Trade Centers. He just saw what he described as parts of bodies. I tried to get him to tell me how many he thought he saw in terms of the number of people killed, and he said it's much, much too many to be counted. Dan?
Scott Pelley in Lower Manhattan. Thomas Paine, 1894, quote, "These are the times that try men's souls." And so is this time that try men's souls. Also, there are times that test the mettle, that test the very character of a nation. Each generation, in one way or the other, faces some kind of maximum test. Who is to say that this is not ours? Timeline: plane crashes into tower of the World Trade Center in Lower Manhattan shortly before 9 a.m. Eastern Time. Just after 9 a.m., second plane crashes into the second tower of the World Trade Center. It's believed that a American Flight 11, Boston to Los Angeles, a Boeing 767 with 81 passengers and 11 crew, was the first of the two planes that struck the World Trade Center just before 9 o'clock. The second plane that hit the second World Trade Center is believed to have been now United Flight 175, also Boston to Los Angeles, a Boeing 767, 56 passengers and 9 crew aboard. Then President Bush in Sarasota, Florida, shortly after 9 o'clock, calls the crisis, quote, an apparent terrorist attack and, quote, a national tragedy. He takes off, says he's going to Washington. He does not. An aircraft crashes near the Pentagon, just outside of Washington, D.C. in Northern Virginia, about an hour after the attacks in New York. Now, it's believed that the plane at the Pentagon was American Flight 77, Dulles Airport near Washington to Los Angeles. That was a Boeing 757, 58 passengers and 6 crew. That American Flight 77 believed to be the plane that hit near the Pentagon. Continuing our timeline, just after 10 a.m. Eastern Time this morning now, that would be, of course, 7 o'clock on the Pacific Coast, government buildings in Washington, including the Capitol and the White House, are evacuated, with officials citing a credible threat of a terrorist attack. Vice President Richard Cheney, for all intents and purposes, has minute-by-minute command inside the White House itself, said to be in a very secure position down below ground. The Federal Aviation Administration shut down all aircraft takeoffs nationwide. That was around 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time this morning. The FAA says that it does not expect to have any air traffic in the country authorized again until about noon tomorrow. Shortly after 10 a.m. Eastern Time, one World Trade Center tower in New York collapses. That was about an hour after being hit by the first plane, American Flight 11. Then senior law enforcement officials said a car bomb exploded outside the State Department in Washington, D.C. Then Federal Protective Services later denied any car bomb attack had occurred. Financial markets suspended trading in the wake of the attacks. That was sometime between 10 and 11 this morning. Then officials at Somerset County Airport, that's near Pittsburgh, said a large plane crashed in western Pennsylvania, about 80 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. That happened at about 10 a.m. That would have been the fourth aircraft. That is believed to have been United Flight 93, Newark, New Jersey to San Francisco, with 38 passengers and 7 crew. That plane, United 93, is believed to be the one that went down in Somerset County in western Pennsylvania, not far from Pittsburgh. Then 10:38 a.m., a fourth explosion rocked what remains of the World Trade Center. This was after the second tower collapsed at 10:28 a.m. So you had one tower go down, and within about a half hour, the second tower went down. Then authorities all across the country were in the process of going on alert, tightening security at strategic facilities, evacuating high-profile buildings. U.S. monuments and museums in Washington, D.C. and in Philadelphia were closed. Tall buildings and some other places in Chicago were shut down. The Securities and Exchange Commission said all financial markets would be closed for the day. Whether the financial markets will be open tomorrow or not remains an open question. They will have some kind of conference call tonight to decide that. We go now to Washington and Bob Schieffer with information on what President Bush has and has not been doing. Bob?
Dan, I'm with Senator Chuck Hagel. He, of course, is a senator from Nebraska and is on the Foreign Relations Committee. He can give us a little information about why it is, Senator, that the president went to Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska.
Well, Bob, as you know, that's a very secure base, Strategic Command. It's the former SAC Command headquarters, and we have as secure facilities below ground as any in the world. So there's no surprise why he went there. I just spoke a half hour ago to some people from Omaha saying that there were a couple of small U.S. Air Force jets that just landed behind the president. We don't know who's on those. I suspect some rather high-ranking officials of the government to confer with the president.
Well, I had heard earlier from sources on Capitol Hill that the president was going to get some extensive face-to-face briefings. It may well be that some officials from Washington have flown out there.
That's probably right, and as I said, that's a very secure location, Strategic Command headquarters in Omaha.
Senator, what do you make of this situation?
Bob, how can one adequately express the horror, the outrage, the terror? What's happened in this country today will forever change America. I said early this morning, it is, as Dan Rather just remarked, each generation faces a challenge. This is the Pearl Harbor of our day, far worse in many respects. But I suspect whoever did this, and we will find whoever did it, has awakened a sleeping giant, to paraphrase another time 50 years ago.
You know, I was just thinking this morning as I was listening to all this unfold, we've been expecting this big partisan scrap in Washington as the president came back from his vacation. Everybody was in disagreement on every issue. Suddenly, all of that has gone by the by. It seems like it was 10 years ago. The Congress has come together. I described it earlier as kind of a mild sense of rage on Capitol Hill, because I noticed that Trent Lott, Tom Daschle have put out a joint statement saying just what you have said, that the two parties, the country, will come together to find these people and to punish whoever did it.
Well, we must. This is a great nation because we're a great people. America will not tolerate this, nor should we, nor can we. And we will come back together and we will build back and we'll be stronger for this. And it is testing us in terrible, horrible ways.
How much do we know right now, Senator?
Well, Bob, I don't claim to know very much, quite frankly. I don't know how much we really know. We are focusing where we must focus first. Secure this nation, secure its leadership, then at the same time take care of those who need our help, the wounded, the injured. And in the process, we are starting to gather information. We will start to unravel that and get the facts. And there will be a very high price to pay, Bob, to whoever did this.
Dan?
Bob Schieffer in Washington. Jim Ogonowski is the brother of an American Airlines pilot, John Ogonowski, who apparently died this morning in the crash of the American Airlines Flight 11. Mr. Ogonowski, first of all, thank you for being with us. Our condolences. And I'm told this is actually on videotape. That'll happen in live television. So in answer to that question, here's what the brother of the dead American Airlines pilot John Ogonowski. Jim Ogonowski had to say.
I'm Jim Ogonowski, and as you all are aware of the tragedy that's impacted our country today, it's been reported that my brother John was the captain of American Airlines Flight 11, which was hijacked out of Logan Airport this morning en route to Los Angeles, California. John leaves behind a loving family, his wife, 3 lovely daughters, his parents, brothers and sisters, numerous aunts and uncles, friends, loving community. Our family is obviously grieving, as is the whole nation, for what has happened today. I personally, I think I'm in shock. I'm in some type of denial. I keep looking at the cornfield behind me, hoping that my brother comes walking on out. This tragedy has not only impacted us as a family, but our whole community, and as a nation, our whole country. On a personal side, I ask that I'll come out for this last time, but please respect my parents and the rest of the family's wishes to be alone at this time. I'll give you a little personal on John. He was 52. He was born in Lowell at St. Joe's Hospital. My other brother Joe was born at St. John's Hospital. He went to St. Stanislaus School on High Street in Lowell, and then he attended Keith Academy. And after that, he attended what is now University of Lowell. It was Lowell Tech at the time. He joined ROTC in the late 60s when it was not cool to be in the military. He joined the military right after being commissioned as second lieutenant in the Air Force. He flew in the Air Force on T-37s and T-38s, and he capped his career off on C-141 transports right at the close of the Vietnam era. He then pursued his lifelong dream and left the military, become an airline pilot. In 1979, he was hired by American Airlines. He's flown for them for 22 years. The most recent years as a captain on a 767.
Jim Ogonowski, speaking of his brother, John, who was the pilot of American Airlines 11, which was the first plane to hit the first World Trade Center building this morning. Poignant moment when he said, "I keep looking at the cornfield behind me and hoping my brother will walk out of it." Now on videotape, the most recent remarks of New York City Mayor Rudolph Giuliani just a few moments ago.
I have to commend not only the people that I was with, but all of the people of the city. We literally escaped with them from the debris, and they handled themselves with bravery, they handled themselves with dignity, they handled themselves in a way that reduced the loss of life. We didn't have panic, we didn't have people running and hurting other people, and people of New York City really distinguished themselves. And I just want to say this once again, New York City is a lot stronger than this, and we're going to overcome it, and the people of New York City are going to give an example of how you stand up to terrorism. You just don't be afraid, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you.
New York City Mayor Giuliani just a few months ago. And by the way, the mayor says that so far there are confirmed 2,100 wounded in New York so far. Now, that's an early count, and one does not want to fuel any unjustified optimism. But there are many people who would believe that the early count might be higher than that. And as we piece together eyewitness information, it's clear that a lot of people got out of the World Trade Center in a hurry when they realized that something was wrong. Many of them came down the stairwells. We've had report after report of people without panic, understanding that a bad situation was developing, got out of the World Trade Center. Now, while some 50,000 people on your average day work in the World Trade Center and thousands more come there as tourists, And while throughout the day there have been, the belief has run strong that many, many people must have died, we want to pause and caution. Nobody knows how many lives have been lost. What we do know is that a lot of lives have been saved, and they were saved by people knowing what they needed to do under an emergency situation and carrying it out with some calm. We go now to Bill Plant at our Washington Bureau. Bill Plant, one of the most experienced White House correspondents anywhere in broadcast journalism. And Bill, you can give us some perspective on what the Secret Service advised the President and why.
I can indeed, Dan, but first let me show you something. We've just received this extra edition of the Washington Times, and this one-word headline, perhaps as well as anything else, sums up what has happened today. This is just the beginning of the reaction that we'll be seeing for days and weeks to come. We were told by the Secret Service that the President wants to come back to the White House. Sources tell us that they're very anxious to reestablish a presence for Mr. Bush at the White House, the seat of the nation's power. It's very symbolic, and the President and his advisors want to do it. But the Secret Service is understandably concerned. They want to be sure, before they say yes to that there is no further danger. So that decision is pending. We're also told by sources that there really was no intelligence whatsoever, no warning of what was to come. No arm of the U.S. government, either military or civilian or National Reconnaissance Agency, none of them apparently picked up any warning about what was about to happen. A short while ago, the President's counselor, Karen Hughes, conducted a briefing at the FBI. She said that she had been in the secure underground room at the White House, the Situation Room, with other White House staffers during the day. And that, by the way, is now linked, we presume, to the President at Offutt Air Force Base for a secret teleconference on the security situation. But Ms. Hughes told reporters at the FBI that the activities of the federal government continue, and this is obviously a point that the administration is very anxious to make, to say that the federal government continues to function despite what happened today. She described in great detail how the Defense Department was being run from inside the damaged DoD building, the Pentagon, and how various other government agencies were under the control of the people who are supposed to be running them. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, has 8 teams of people on the ground in New York for search and rescue, 4 teams here in Washington at the Pentagon. The whole idea of this briefing was to reassure the nation that the federal government continues to function. And that, of course, as we said, Dan, is why they want to get the President back to the White House as soon as they can.
Bill Plant in our Washington Bureau. You may want to note that the President was visiting Florida today, where his brother is the governor and up for re-election. Those two things may or may not be connected, but the fact is that President Bush was in Florida this morning. When he first heard about what had happened at the World Trade Center, he said that he was breaking off his trip and would be flying back to Washington. I believe that's correct. But obviously, as events developed, the decision was made that the President would not return to Washington, and he still has not returned to Washington, so far as anybody can figure out, and as far as we can determine, that he went instead to Barksdale Air Force Base outside Shreveport, Louisiana. There he videotaped another statement to the American people, somewhat longer, among other things calling for the prayers of those families most directly affected. And then, unannounced, he took off and went to destination unknown, but it became known that that was Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska. Now, as Senator Chuck Hagel explained to Bob Schieffer not long ago, while these pictures were being shown on American television, the decision was being made to take President Bush to that air base in Nebraska because, said Senator Hagel, it is among the most secure U.S. military bases in the world. It was formerly the headquarters for SAC, the Strategic Air Command, which featured B-52s in the air at all times as part of our defense in the Cold War. So the President was taken there for a briefing. Obviously, there have been some discussions about the symbolism of the President of the United States being kept out of the White House, and was it a good idea for him to return immediately? The decision obviously was made no, and now a decision in progress, if indeed it has not already been made, of where the President is to spend this night. I want to go to Bob Orr in our Washington Bureau as well, as you look at videotape of what happened here in Manhattan earlier this morning. Bob?
federal authorities have to figure out over the coming days is how did this attack take place? I mean, how was it that hijackers managed to penetrate the nation's aviation system all at the same time at 3 of the busiest airports? Now, it's very important to know, as we watch the pictures, what exactly happened today in terms of a timeline. Just before 7 o'clock at Boston and at Newark and at Washington's Dulles, some number of hijackers, it's not clear yet how many, made their way through the normal checkpoints, boarded planes like everybody else, and then we know what happened from there. The timing is important. These are probably among the busiest times for any of the nation's airports. That is among the most vulnerable points during the day. The other thing to remember here is that all of these attacks apparently were suicide attacks. And it's always been a fear of the U.S. aviation experts that this is the very kind of attack that we are most vulnerable for. Very, very hard to stop. I mean, a lot of the system is built on the belief that most people want to remain alive. If you have somebody who is perfectly willing to die in the attack, then you mean you have to catch them at that magnetometer, that screening place where they look for guns. We don't know how the hijackers commandeered these airplanes. Perhaps the cockpit voice tapes, if they can be found, will shed some light on that. But they may have used guns, maybe they didn't use guns. But if there were enough of them, it's a conceivable theory that these pilots may have been overpowered, and you don't need a gun to do that. And once somebody has control of that airplane, it's going to go where whoever has their hands on the control puts it. It's a real dilemma, but whoever planned this attack chose some of the busiest airports at one of the busiest times of the day, and also I think it's worth noting, chose 2 of the largest symbols of the U.S. aviation system. United Airlines, the biggest airline in America, and American Airlines, the second biggest. And I think that all of this came together at a point in time where the system just could not handle it. Dan?
Bob Orr, true or untrue that major airlines are supposed to keep the cockpit door locked during flight? Frankly, I fly a fair amount, and it's been a long time since I've seen one of those locked doors.
Yes,
but is that supposed to be the rule?
It is the rule, and it's a weakness in the system. Oftentimes, there are things in the system where the rule is not followed to the letter. We don't know, and I think it's worth reminding people that we don't know, Dan, how these hijackers made their way into the cockpit. But perhaps the door was unlocked, perhaps there were enough hijackers on the plane that simply force was used. But it is something that I assure you the FAA is already going back to look at. There have been a number of GAO investigations, a number of oversight hearings on Capitol Hill, looking at these very issues. What do we do at the screening points to make sure that we have maximum security? And then what do we do in the air to give the pilots the best chance to save the plane and the people on board? Obviously today, something went very, very wrong. It was a very deliberate attack and one that was obviously well planned. Dan?
Bob Orr, as we continue to show pictures of what happened in Lower Manhattan during and after the collapse of the World Trade Center, and occasionally show pictures of the Pentagon being hit by hijacked planes, let's talk about what are supposed to be security things on the ground. No one wants to be flip about this situation, but anybody who travels knows that what was supposed to be security systems on the ground at most, if not all airports, number one, are manned by people who are outsourced contractors and who are paid, if not minimum wage, something near minimum wage. I've heard airline travelers talk about this for years. Has anybody in Washington been aware of, it's hard to get an absolute first-class security system when it's low